Mention the name Regd in Edrang and you'll be told stories of a glorious freedom fighter. In Orlin, he used his tactical savvy and battle training to protect the Glanfathan from the encroaching evil of the invaders in the Deerwood. Ask someone in the Deerwood about him, and you'll hear angry retellings of the exploits of an underhanded, dirty fighting Orlin who terrorized Deerwooden citizens. This conflict is what legends are built on, and Galven Regd is the stuff of legend. The Broken Stone War began from a misunderstanding between the Glanfathans who lived in the Deerwood and the Edrang colonists who were moving in. Tensions were already high between the two groups, as the Adherents claimed land the Glanfathans said they already owned. Add to it the Glanfathans taken and forced into slavery by the Adherents, and it was only a matter of time before something snapped and sent the two groups to war. There was the occasional skirmish or fight between isolated groups, but no real conflict until the Broken Stone War. Whether intentional or not, Adherent farmers, clearing land for their crops, knocked over and destroyed one of the ancient menhirs that dot the countryside. The Glanfathans, who revered the ancient structures in the Deerwood, reacted swiftly and violently, led by a particularly fanatical Fang by the name of Regd. While the war was short-lived and the Glanfathans were ultimately not the victors, Regd and his forces were able to eliminate a significant number of colonists. After the war, Regd was appointed the Galven, or leader, of the Glanfathan tribes. His leadership skills and prowess in battle earned him the respect of all the tribes of Glanfath. Because all of the tribes were united behind him, he was able to move and coordinate their warriors in a way that organized them into such an efficient team, the Edrang colonists lived in fear of his next attack. His name and reputation spread through both lands. After 2 years following the Broken Stone War, Regd and his forces, using deception, misinformation, and straightforward guerrilla tactics, killed Hadrets. The remaining earls sent word to the Farkoneg, saying something must be done before more nobility is killed, but Regd continued to terrorize the colonists, and it seemed the campaign would never end. That is, until he encountered Edrang Hadret. Edrang Hadret, in retrospect, led a remarkable life, but his contributions would probably have gone largely unnoticed if it were not for his conflict with the Glanfathan Orlin by the name of Galven Regd. Though Edrang became a great man and a well-respected leader, his early life was uneventful. He was born in a Deer of noble parents, spent a good part of his childhood there. While he was raised apart from the common folk, he felt a connection to them and was known to always be welcoming to any and all. In school, he demonstrated incredible intelligence, frequently arriving at correct conclusions using his own methods of getting there. He was always doing unexpected things, and though he seemed to be paying attention and would pass his lessons, his teachers and trainers were certain he would never amount to anything. His family moved to the Deerwood as colonists while he was still a teen. The moment they docked in the new land, Edrang knew he had found his true home. He explored the land, getting to know it and its people, as well as he knew the castle in which he lived. He grew into a man who was well respected by all who met him. He took over the earldom, becoming a fair and much beloved leader. Under his leadership, Balreach thrived, becoming more stable and prosperous than anyone thought possible. When a new Gref was needed, the people's voice was unanimous: Edrang Hadret. As his first act as the new Gref, the Farkoneg instructs Edrang to build a new city for him, a seat of power in the Pearlwood Gulf. The city is to be called New Dunrid, and will serve as the capital for the new colonies. Not long after he assumed power, the Broken Stone War began. It was a quick and brutal war, and taxed the limits of Edrang's capabilities. He had never before encountered someone as organized and brutal as the opposition commander, Galven Regd. At first, Regd's tactics confounded Edrang, but Edrang, who grew up developing unorthodox ways to take care of his problems, adapted quickly. This did not stop Galven Regd outright, however. He began a campaign of terror that lasted for 2 more years. Edrang, who expressed a sort of respect for Regd's prowess, studied his techniques, learning how Regd attacked and devising ways to counter it. He gave the earls and thanes instructions that confounded and sometimes infuriated them, as he seemed to leave their lands open for attack and put their people at risk. Edrang disseminated lies and half-truths about his plans, imperial events, and military maneuvers. No one knew what truly was going on except for Edrang and a very small contingent of trusted friends and advisors. His tactics worked, and Edrang's men started to catch the Glenfathans off guard. It wasn't long before Edrang's men were able to anticipate Regd's moves and cut him off at every front. When asked how he was able to overcome an enemy that anticipated every move, Edrang responded, "That is how he was about to outwit us. Our moves were transparent. Anyone could see through the standard tactic. Spread something out thin enough and you can poke a hole in it. I countered an unpredictable enemy with unpredictability." Because Edrang was able to counter Regd's plans, the conflict eventually died off. Regd sent a message to Edrang, expressing respect for his tactics and prowess with military maneuvers. This political and military stalemate led to the first treaty signed between the Glenfathans and the Edrang colonists, who would eventually become the Deerwoodens. Little could one know that the man who once destroyed part of his own country with fire would become the Deerwood's most beloved leader. Martyred in the war he started to free his people from oppressive rule, there isn't a Deerwooden who doesn't know of or revere Admeth for what he did. Strangely, even though there are records of his father Edrang's childhood, and even though he was raised in nobility in the Deerwood, while it was still a deer territory, information about Admeth's early years is nearly impossible to find. Admeth is not known for his childhood, though. He is known for saving the Deerwood and uniting it with his sworn enemy, the Glenfathans. In 2652 AI, the Deerwooden troubles with Erfrkonig were at a boiling point. Several of the earls under Edrang's rule, provoked by the imperial court in Adir, resumed looting the ruins around Deerwood that the Glenfathans held sacred. When the Glenfathans finally retaliated, it was overwhelmingly brutal and resulted in a slave uprising. Galven Regd, whom Edrang had fought before, resumed control of the Glenfathan troops. Regd was also able to convince some Delmgan to join the fight. Edrang was, at this point, far too old to lead his forces into battle, so he sent his son Admeth in his place to contain the threat. Admeth, true to form as the son of Edrang, and obviously having learned tactics from his father, made a dangerous but effective tactical decision. In order to prevent Regd's troops from using the woods as cover, and to keep them from advancing through his land, he set fire to the forest at the tributary of the Issaur River, and positioned his troops to prevent any of the Glenfathan forces from retreating. This tactic proved to be effective. While some Glenfathans and Delmgan were able to escape, thousands died. In the skirmish that followed, Galven Regd was captured and sent to be held at New Heomar. Admeth was able to do what his father spent decades trying to do. He stopped Galven Regd. The conflict with the Glenfathans continued for several months, and Admeth repeated the scorched earth tactic several times to flush the opposing forces from key battlefields. He was able to bring the conflict to an end before the year ended. While it was a win for the Deerwoodens, It was very costly as well. Because of his tactics, the conflict earned the name the War of Black Trees. After Edrang's death in 2654, Admeth became the Gref of the Deerwood to the dismay of the imperial court and the other earls. Over the course of the next year, they defied his rule at every turn, rebuking his decrees and countermanding his directives. In 2655 AI, Admeth had had enough. Even though he lacked support from most of the earls, he was admired by both the valiant dukes and all the common folk. Backed by this support, he issued an ultimatum to the Verkoneg to appoint him a Gref Palatine. Verkoneg, unwilling to deal with a rebellion while trying to establish a new warless trade in Hadrets, agreed. Admeth then held authority and legal power over the earls, their holdings, and their titles. The Deerwood was no longer a Grefram, but instead was a Palatinate. This change reduced the Verkoneg's power over the region. With his new power, Admeth quickly brought the rebellious earls into line. But in exchange for the power, Admeth invested time and money into all of the Deerwood's ports and trade posts, dramatically increasing shipping traffic. This helped the earls and brought in more money for the Verkoneg. Over the 5 years following his ascension to Gref, Admeth attempted to mend relations with the Glanfathans and bring his land together with theirs. He enacted laws that restricted the taking of new slaves, allowed Glanfathans to buy their fellows out of bondage, and imposed a tax on slave ownership in order to promote the use of free labor. While there was some resistance to these new laws, the Verkoneg's attention to Hadrets and Admeth's power, backed by the colonists, made it difficult for the earls to truly resist what was happening. In 2662 AI, in the year of the 10th anniversary of the War of Black Trees, Admeth brought about the end of slavery in the Deerwood. He negotiated a series of treaties with the Glanfathans, wherein a timeline was established for the official emancipation of all remaining slaves. Each owner would receive compensation in either land or money based on the number of slaves freed. If they didn't comply, the slaves would be seized, and their former masters would suffer a substantial fine. In return for this, the Glanfathans opened trade routes with the Deerwood, and allowed Deerwoodans to live in and near areas that had their sacred ruins, but they were, under no conditions, to enter the ruins. As a final act of goodwill, Admeth freed Galven Regd, saying he had suffered sufficiently for his actions. The Verkoneg, seeing he was completely out of control in his own Palatinate, devised a plan to get the supply of ancient artifacts running again. He approached the earls suffering under Admeth's rule and convinced them to hire agents to raid the ruins. Initially, they did so in secret, but they quickly became sloppy, eventually being caught. This breach of the treaties incited Glanfathans again to acts of violence, while Admeth researched who was behind it. With help of the Glanfathan leaders, Admeth found evidence and pointed back to the Verkoneg as the source of the raids. That was the beginning of the end for a Deer rule in the Deerwood. Over the next 7 years, Admeth and the Verkoneg maneuvered around each other, playing political, economic, and military games in order to gain the upper hand. In 2668 AI, Admeth declared the Deerwood had had enough. The Verkoneg would no longer be recognized. The Deerwood was now a free entity and would govern itself. This started the War of Defiance, which lasted 5 years. The end result of the war was freedom for the Deerwood, and though Duke Hadret would never live to see it come to a close, the people of Deerwood consider him the founder of the country, nevertheless.